So I'm a little bit illiterate when it comes to sound and engineering. So what is your role as a sound engineer?
Well, as a recording engineer, essentially my role is there to capture the performances of the artist, and that can take many forms, really. I mean, essentially, it's putting a load of microphones up in the studio, pushing the faders up, and recording it in one way or another. But obviously, that's oversimplifying it.
So how do you captivate that sound? How do you know when you've found that sound, the perfect sound?
Well, the whole process actually really starts more with discussion. What you have to do is find out from the artist what it is they're trying to achieve with the songs that they've got. Going to see a gig is a very good thing to do, because then you get an idea when they're playing live of how they want to present their music.
Do you set them up in the studio the same way as they would be on stage at a gig?
It depends on the type of artist. Certainly with ACDC we did that. Malcolm is on the left and Angus is on the right, and so it's
Angus skips from the left to the right, doesn't he?
Well, yes, but if you did that on record, it'd get a little bit sickening, moving backwards and forwards. But but the general sort of picture is roughly like that. But that's by no means a sort of a regulation thing that anybody does.
So what's your approach to working with musicians?
Goodness me! I mean, how long have you got?
As long as you want.
Lock
the doors.
It's really this thing of finding out what it is they want to achieve. That's what you're there to do, is to actually act as, if you like, a sort of interpreter. And that's where it crosses over into the production side of things. I grew up in a music industry where the line between engineers and producers was not a clearly defined thing.
Right.
We sort of considered ourselves to be part of the production process. So it is very much about communication. It's very much about enabling the artist to do what they want. One of the things that you quite often find with, even with extremely talented musicians, and it's the same with a lot of talented artists and creative people, that they're not particularly eloquent in terms of describing what they want to do. So sometimes you have to sort of dive in there and try and interpret what it is they're trying to say,
right.
Extrapolate the ideas that they have, and sort of put some meat on the bones, if you like, of what they've got in their head. Sometimes delving inside a musician's head is
difficult.
It's a scary place to go, that's for sure.
I want to talk about ACDC for a second. You worked on the album Highway to Hell.
Yeah.
And on the album Back in Black.
Yeah.
Now, between that period of the two albums, Bon obviously died, and the band considered splitting up, but 5 months later they went and recorded the album. What were emotions like in the studio?
By the time we got into the studio, it was clearly evident we were going to make an album. Obviously, the whole process was a massive shock. I really expected them to carry on, I must say.
Did you expect the album to be as huge as it was? 49 million copies, give or take.
No, you can never predict anything like that. I like to feel that I always make the best album that can be made, but it's a set of circumstances that leads to something being that massive. By that point, ACDC had done enough of the groundwork for them to really take off. But I think the combination of factors was huge. It certainly helped that there was an immense amount of backup publicity, if you like,
from Bon's death
and the new singer coming in. But fundamentally, what made that album sell that many copies was that it was a great set of songs that were brilliantly produced by Mutt, brilliantly recorded by me, of course,
obviously,
brilliantly mixed by me as well. But this was a band that were absolutely at the top of their game, and yeah, perhaps the circumstances focused their minds. Certainly, when we were in the studio, it was a very close-knit group of people. We were all feeling a little bit of the pain in one way or another, but by the same token, we were all very committed to making sure that Brian felt as comfortable as he possibly could. Because, not many people think about the massive task that he undertook at that point in time. He's coming into what was an emerging, very big rock band from a career that had somewhat stalled, and on the coattails of a singer who was extraordinary, to say the very, very least. And it was, you know, these are huge shoes to step into and fill.
How did Bon kind of like differ to work with compared to Brian Johnson?
You know, Bon was very much the kind of the rebel, totally sort of
Off the hook.
yeah, off the hook sort of person. Brian a little bit more focused and coming from perhaps a slightly more mature attitude towards the job in hand, you know, and realising the enormity of the job, and came in, you know, with a very, very professional attitude, determined to absolutely give it 150%, which he did, of course.
Yeah. Obviously, you sold 49 million copies on Back in Black. Did you get caught up in any of the hype of it, or was it just the band, and did you take a step back?
I was extremely excited, very, very excited, because...
Did it go to your head?
I don't think so, no. It's, you know, one of the good things about growing up in the music industry at Island Studios was that we had this constant procession of huge, fantastic artists walking through. I mean, one of the stories I always tell is that literally the week after I started at Island as an assistant engineer, I walked into the studio office and there were only 3 bands in for the next 3 months, and they were Led Zeppelin, The Who and Free.
That's a pretty good way to kickstart your career,
yeah, I thought,
isn't it?
I've died and gone to heaven here. This is fantastic. And one of the things that really sets those people apart is that they know when the performance is to be done, and they know when the work is to be done. You know.
How do you think that, like, the band's ethics of how they work back in 1980 to how they work today? Do you think they kind of have the same graft about them, or...?
One of the things that frustrates me greatly is that the reference points that bands use, they don't actually take the time to go back as far as the bands from the 70s and the 80s. Those bands did their homework, and they went in there and they got hold of music that really, really did serve their roots,
yeah.
And then they brought it forwards. You know, I mean, I don't know if you read Keith Richards' book.
I have.
I think it's a fantastic book. It gives a real insight into the workings of bands like the Rolling Stones, and you know, the fact that he was such a fan of all of that blues music that went way back, and jazz music and folk music and as well, and how he took that and really learned what was at the core of it, what was at the heart of it, and then brought it forward and incorporated it into his own music. That, I think, is a talent that is sadly lacking in a lot of musicians now. I don't hear it. What I hear is people copying rather than interpreting, you know.
What do you think of, like, using the internet to promote your stuff and get a fan base? Are you a fan of, like, the Facebook, MySpace, Twitter and all that?
Not particularly, no. I think they have their place, but I think that far too much is made of those social networking opportunities. I think the problem with the internet is that it's given everybody the possibility to promote themselves.
Yeah.
And that means that it's very difficult to filter. So, you know, your average consumer, I put myself in the same bracket, you know, finding music that you might want to listen to is more and more difficult. I still tend to return to recommendations from friends. I'm a big fan, for instance, of Spotify Radio,
right.
Where you can... I mean, I came across a band called the Band of Skulls, who I think are absolutely stunning.
Right.
Quite amazing band. Great songs. Their new album is sensational. Because I tuned into Spotify Radio, and I discovered through another artist that I was listening, I think it was Rufus Wainwright, and then I discovered Joan as a Policewoman, and then on Joan as a Policewoman's radio I discovered Band of Skulls. Now that for me is the best way that these things work. I think that putting your page up on MySpace and then sending it out to as many people,
spamming everybody,
befriending as many people as you possibly can is actually probably more counterproductive than it is productive.
Back in 1980, when you were working with like ACDC, obviously you didn't have the internet like we had it today. So how did they promote and like get their music heard? Gig every single night around the country.
I remember Malcolm telling me a story. Well, no, actually it was Bond telling me a story that when they started out in Australia, they'd sometimes do 3 and 4 gigs a day.
You don't see bands doing that anymore, do you?
No, I mean, I've seen bands come off stage after doing one gig and they're completely flattened. You know?
So they haven't got the stamina anymore.
I don't know. I think they get the stamina if they thought that it was a worthwhile thing to be doing.
Back in the day, obviously you worked with the Rolling Stones, the Who, at the beginning of your career, and Paul McCartney.
Yeah,
Did you ever get starstruck?
Not especially, no.
Starstruck?
No, not especially. With the Rolling Stones and the Who, that was as an assistant, and at the time, those sessions were either with Andy Johns, who was the engineer for the Rolling Stones, or Glyn Johns, his elder brother, who's the father of Ethan Johns.
Right.
They were the engineers and producers on those sessions, and I was much more concerned about learning from them than I was about who was, playing in the studio. So, I mean, there were a couple of points. There was one point I took a tray of tea into a session. So
that's not rock and roll.
Well, it is very rock and roll, actually. But I took a tray of tea in because I'd made some tea, and I thought, well, they might want some in there. And there was a guitar player playing, and I looked into the dark of the studio. I couldn't see who it was, and I said to the engineer, "Who is that?" It was a Stephen Stills session. This guy was playing on it. "Who is that?" And he said, "Oh, it's Jimi Hendrix."
I think if Jimi Hendrix walked in here, I'd pass out.
Well, I think I probably
well, yeah, because he's dead now, but like the Rolling
That would
Stones
be a moment that would make me starstruck.
Any of the bands you've worked with, I'd probably faint if I met them. How do you think the music industry is today? What's your opinion on it?
I think it's really exciting. I think I believe there are huge opportunities in the music industry right now.
Where do you see the opportunities?
Well, because it's a sort of an open palette, really. You can write your own ideas. I think we're severely lacking in entrepreneurial skills. I don't see good A&R out there much. I don't see that many good managers out there of artists.
Right.
Everybody wants an easy ride, But I think there are immense opportunities out there for people to just sort of do it their own way.
When you say you don't see the A&R people, where are they going wrong in your opinion?
We don't have a full record company infrastructure anymore, which is probably a good thing. But I like the fact there are smaller record companies. And I like the fact that in those small record companies you have a few people doing all the jobs. But I think what we need to do is we need to start looking at the way the record industry is set up and just decide, well, we can rebuild this in a different way. You don't have to have the infrastructure that we've had in the past. What I keep seeing people doing is making the mistake of just sort of getting comfortable with the way it used to be again, and every time somebody sets a new company up, you think, oh, this might be exciting, this might be different, and then all of a sudden it's the same old. I think that the interplay between the producer and the artist is one of the best things now that's come out of the new music industry, or the way the face of the music industry now.
What do you think of Simon Cowell's effect on the music industry?
Oh, if that person that broke into his house, no.
Yeah, go on, carry on.
I think, well, it's not the music industry. It's TV. It's greed, and it's he's in it for himself.
So you're not a fan of the X Factor?
Not in the slightest.
Right.
No.
What about The Voice, the new show on BBC?
I was discussing it with a few colleagues today. Actually, I think it has some potential.
Yeah.
The problem with all of those things is it does rather encourage people to look for the fast track, and I don't think there is a fast track. You see, the other thing that I think is really good about the modern music business is that the relationship between the artist and the consumer, the artist and the fan, is being reconstructed, and it's more direct. There was a period in the 80s when the major record companies quite deliberately separated the artist from their fan base.
How do you mean they separated?
Well, they took over. It was the emergence of websites and stuff like that, and they tried to sort of stop. They controlled absolutely everything about what the artist did, which meant that and they branded them. They turned them into brands rather than letting them be, people and musicians and so on. And it's a fine line of difference, but I think it is one that I don't think the consumers really reacted particularly well to that.
What bands have caught your eye? What have you seen? Any up and coming bands that you know?
This band I worked with at the end of last year, These Furrows, a band from Leicester, absolutely fantastic band, great songs, really, really good live personalities, you know.
What are you doing with yourself these days?
Well, I'm in the mid. I've just finished an album with a singer, a Dutch singer who originally comes from Suriname, called Cameron Bell. We've just finished her album, and that's in the process of getting launched. Yeah. I've just got back from the Canadian Arctic, because I'm working with a band called State of the Art. We've just finished writing the songs. We've still got top lines and lyrics to finish, but that's an album that we're going to start recording sometime in July.